Hi, welcome to another episode of Tori Watches Movies, where I, Tori, have a stream of consciousness that ruins all of your favorite movies by thinking way too hard about them. Today's episode looks at Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca and compares it to Guillermo del Toro's 2015 film Crimson Peak. I know it seems a little weird to take a classic like Rebecca and compare it to a movie that you might not have even heard of, but Del Toro is the one who actually first made the connections between the two films, where in an interview with Entertainment Network, he actually cited Rebecca as one of the main inspirations for Crimson Peak. The similarities in plot are definitely striking. They're both about young women who marry tall, dark, handsome strangers and then go live in their creepy house and find themselves being thwarted at every turn by a really creepy female villain. However, in order to understand how these stories really mesh together, we're going to compare the three main characters in both films and examine the way that the gender roles are subverted in Crimson Peak rather than followed as they are in Rebecca. So first off are our heroines, the second Mrs. De Winter in Rebecca, played by Joan Fontaine, and Edith Cushing in Crimson Peak, played by Mia Wasikowska. So I'm not really going to spend that much time talking about these women because it's kind of a given that Edith is going to win the prize for strongest female character. And Rebecca, the heroine, who doesn't even get to have her own name. It's so sad. Well, she does everything that she can to please her husband, and after a long, long time of standing loyally beside her husband and never giving in to the urge to leave him alone with his precious memories of his first wife, Rebecca, she is rewarded at the end of the film with the promise of potential domestic happiness with her darling husband. Edith, on the other hand, is a wealthy heiress, an aspiring horror novelist who makes it very clear from the beginning that she does not give a fuck about gender roles. She marries against her father's wishes, she retains her bodily agency throughout the course of the movie, she figures out what's going on with the ghost problem in her creepy new house, and uses physical and intellectual skill to defeat the villain at the end of the film. Oh. And she also happens to save the life of some guy who shows up in the last 20 minutes of the film to save her life. Well done, Edith. 10 out of 10. The much more problematic female characters, however, are Mrs. Danvers, the creepy housekeeper in Rebecca, played by Judith Anderson, and Lucille, the sister-in-law in Crimson Peak, played by Jessica Chastain. This is the specific connection between the two films that Del Toro was citing in this interview. So Mrs. Danvers and Lucille have very similar functions in their respective films: to keep the lovers apart and to pose a threat to this potential domestic happiness. But they even have a similar look. They're both very austere, tall women with long, dark, high-necked dresses who are very, very much attached to these creepy houses to the point where they both die as the houses fall at the end of the film. It's a little bit terrifying. But the real fun with Mrs. Danvers and Lucille, however, is the potential for queer readings of their characters. So Mrs. Danvers fills the stereotype of a lesbian villainess, which is a stereotype in classic Hollywood that you might not even really know of anymore because of the way that our views on the LGBT community has changed. But queer theorist Robin Wood actually cites Mrs. Danvers as the only lesbian in all of Hitchcock. So kind of a big deal. But it is clear to the viewer that Mrs. Danvers' villainy is purely motivated by her homosexual desire for the deceased Rebecca, the first wife of our hero. And so this is especially true of the scene in the film where Mrs. Danvers is showing the second Mrs. De Winter all of Rebecca's old undergarments and fur coats. It's this really upsetting fetishization of Rebecca's absent body that scholar Rona F. Berenstein refers to as a manipulation of a humorous coming out scene, because that's the moment where we know that Mrs. Danvers is a lesbian. Lucille, however, makes our analysis a little more complicated. She commits acts of incest with her brother Thomas, which is a form of queer behavior in the sense that it is a non-normative sexual behavior. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation. So her desire to keep Edith and Thomas apart stems from her sexual desire for her own brother Thomas, just as Mrs. Danvers comes from her desire for Rebecca. There is even a similar coming out subversion scene in Crimson Peak that is similar to that of the underwear scene in Rebecca. Edith, our heroine, is walking down a corridor and she stumbles upon Lucille giving her brother a hand job. It's this just really cringy moment that makes the viewer wish they could be literally anywhere else. But it functions the same as the underwear scene in Rebecca. However, the fact that Lucille is not a lesbian is a really important distinction. Her queerness comes from her deliberate choices and the way that these choices affect the other people in her life. It has nothing to do with her sexual orientation, and no attempt is made to villainize her because of any kind of non-normative sexual orientation. So Crimson Peak has avoided a really harmful homophobic stereotype that we see in the lesbian villainess that Hitchcock employed. But it also creates this archetypal, sexually insatiable gothic villainess that we've come to expect of the genre. But finally, we must compare our two heroes, Maxim de Winter of Rebecca and Thomas Sharp of Crimson Peak, played by Laurence Olivier and Tom Hiddleston, who are both very famous specifically for being tall, dark, and handsome. But anyway, Maxim's character is fairly straightforward. He's what film scholar Kim Wheatley labels as a hero villain, in that the character who offers our heroine this escape and this beautiful opportunity for domesticity is also the very man who threatens her potential to have that through his own behaviors and communicative patterns with her. So Maxim is a man who represents an old classicist patriarchal model as a single wealthy man with this big empty house who needs a wife to be complacent and fill it for him. So he seems to really cherish the second Mrs. De Winter, specifically because she is nothing like his sex-crazed, disobedient first wife, Rebecca. He likes that his wife is naive and sweet and virginal. This is evident in the scene where the second Mrs. De Winter buys a black dress from a fashion magazine and is very pleased with herself to present it to him, but Maxim very patronizingly flatters her, but is like, you would never want to wear something like that, implying that she's not appealing to him when she looks womanly. So Maxim maintains the power in their relationship by making sure that the second Mrs. De Winter will never be anything like Rebecca. Even though it's worth pointing out that he was never truly victimized by Rebecca because she died as a form of cosmic punishment for her upending of the patriarchal order that Maxim represents. On the other hand, though, Thomas Sharp takes a very feminine position within the story of Crimson Peak. So in spite of his intention to let his sister murder his new wife, Thomas falls deeply in love with Edith after their marriage begins, and he really struggles with how to reconcile these feelings for Edith with the feelings that he has for his sexually abusive sister that he has been in an incestuous relationship with for basically his whole life. And so in the end, he recognizes his position as a victim of this abuse, and he stands up to Lucille on Edith's behalf. And so then Lucille kills him in a fit of jealous rage, which means that Thomas takes on a feminine position within the narrative. He sacrificed his own life so that his love, Edith, can live on to pursue the active resolution that we see at the end of the narrative. So Thomas never upheld the patriarchal powers of his marriage because he was never a force of masculine power in the story to begin with, instead always deferring his power to his sister and his wife. The most convincing case of this, though, is the scene in which Edith and Thomas consummate their marriage. Edith sets it up as a moment similar to the second Mrs. De Winter's black dress, where she is attempting to get her husband to be interested in sexual relations with her. But unlike Maxim, Thomas accepts her proposition, and then the sex ensues in a scene that is just really different from the way that we're used to seeing this role. We're used to seeing a naked female form for the viewing pleasure of a heterosexual male audience member, which is what is described by female feminist film critic Laura Mulvey. And so in this scene, Thomas climbs on top of Edith and removes all of his clothing, while Edith remains fully clothed in a gown that is almost comically large. Wow, they're showing male nudity. And even more so, all of the sexual acts that Thomas is performing in this scene are to provide pleasure for Edith, including an overt depiction of him performing oral sex on her. This is a direct subversion of what Mulvey explains, and we know that this is intentional. In an interview with E! Network, Tom Hiddleston described his role playing Thomas in this scene, saying that he thinks men don't get naked enough in movies, and that this is meant to demonstrate Thomas's first healthy sexual encounter. By positioning Thomas's body as the object of Edith's desire in the film, the viewer is left really uncertain. Female bodies are usually for the pleasure of male viewers, but this scene leaves the audience not knowing whose gaze Thomas's body is for. So this sex scene is the epitome of Thomas's feminization, of his role as a character with no real power and who is left to serve as an object of sexual desire for his sister, his wife, and possibly even for the gaze of female audience members. So now that we've been through this analysis, why do all of these connections between the two movies matter? Well, Gothic literature has always been dismissed as soft women's stories. But if the Gothic stereotypes in Crimson Peak can undergo this modernization that we see, then we may be on the cusp of retelling Gothic narratives through film or literature in ways that can be consumed by women without them being considered lowbrow or just patriarchal cautionary tales. So Crimson Peak may never be a new Hollywood classic, but if it can help push forward this movement, it definitely has some important things to say. So thank all of you for watching another episode of Tori Watches Movies. Feel free to click on any of my links below, click subscribe, and we will see you next time.